Hello, and welcome to Radio Free America. If you aren't aware, the platform I am most active on is TikTok. That's where I have the most following by far, and where I make the most content, like multiple videos per day. TikTok has a feature in which it lets you repost a video that you made on the anniversary of its initial posting. And a few days ago, it presented to me a video that I had made a year prior, and I reposted it.
We're Uyghurs. Of course we're suffering from a genocide in 2024.
You're Uyghur propagandists. Of course you'll avoid the actual Muslim genocide being done to Palestinians by your CIA handlers and instead lie about one happening in China and base it off of CIA propaganda.
So this video that I stitched on TikTok and reposted was from the Uyghur Youth Initiative. I was responding to a silly little video they made, which this Radio Free Asia article is about. Now I'm not going to get too deep into the story behind this. I have in other videos. But just to sum it up, essentially, the women who made the video did so after Zumrate Arkin, the director of the Women's Committee at the World Uyghur Congress, suggested they take advantage of the of course trend on social media. The World Uyghur Congress is a CIA cutout. We'll get to that a little bit later in this video, but the people in the Uyghur Youth Initiative were instructed to take advantage of a social media trend and make a video about it, and that video just happened to go extremely viral. I'm sure it's totally organic. They definitely earned those millions of views of their own accord. No funny business there. Just ignore what's on the screen. It is completely unrelated to the situation at hand. So obviously I was making a claim here, or maybe just making a joke, about how the Uyghur Youth Initiative has ties to the CIA, at least indirectly, and someone in the comments asked me to prove it. They told me not to make baseless claims. So to prove it, I linked them to a website, whatifithappenedtoyou.com. Here's that website. And if you want to know more information about the situation around this, go see my previous video about it. Essentially, the Uyghur Youth Initiative used to run this website called whatifithappenedtoyou.com. It was from a campaign that they did in collaboration with some CIA organizations, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Campaign for Uyghurs. They very carelessly let their domain expire, so I swept it up from under them and made my own little website explaining the situation. And in response to me linking that website, this mysterious account with just a single letter for a name, M, and a profile picture that is a cat wearing a kufi, they made an entire Google Doc in response. So we're going to be taking a look at that in this video. Here is the document, so let's dive right in. M starts with, before you read my response, I would like to say that I fully read your post on your website, whatifithappenedtoyou.com, and I would appreciate if you take the time to read my response. We will. They continue. I am responding to your section. So what's really happening in Xinjiang? All sources that I have used for the purpose of this are acceptable in scholarly settings and from respectable sources. Now, do we believe it? Now, I understand that the sources that M is probably going to use could be considered acceptable and respectable in scholarly settings, in the West at least, but that's because Western academia was captured by imperial interests many decades ago. What's important to me is whether or not these sources would hold up in the court of law, for instance, because a lot of the so-called evidence about this so-called genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang relies on witness testimony. This witness testimony is often or always done behind closed doors. It is never subject to cross-examination, and it is never done under oath, so there is no penalty for lying. If you tried to present that in the court of law, you would be laughed out of the room. M continues, I also noticed that in many of your comments you respond to people bringing up valid criticism and points by saying, prove it, no CIA, I do say that, but using American-based and funded sources yourself. I understand that you have a different worldview than my own, but I believe it is important we discuss and debate topics like this to come towards a better understanding of the issues at large. Now look, M. I'm not sure if you understand the situation here, right? I'm saying that if you want to prove some allegations against America's enemy, you should not be citing the CIA to do so, right? That makes sense. If I use Western sources to disprove Western narratives, there's no issue there. There's no conflict of interest there. That's what we're looking at here, a conflict of interest. Now, you could make this claim if you were saying that I often use Chinese government sources, but I don't. The reason that I mostly, or perhaps exclusively, use Western sources is because that's all that Western liberals will accept. Western liberals love Wikipedia, so if I can cite Wikipedia, I will. If I can work around Wikipedia's Western capitalist bias, then I will do so. So now M is addressing one of the claims that I made on my website. I said, despite accusing China of human rights violations in Xinjiang, the USA and the other white Western countries that are perpetuating this lie have never been able to prove anything. Meanwhile, diplomats from 30 Muslim-majority countries traveled to Xinjiang in 2022 and reported that China was doing an excellent job in the region. Now here is the source for that claim. It's from Middle East Monitor. Diplomats from 30 Muslim countries visited China's Xinjiang region. It was a delegation of 32 envoys and senior diplomats from 30 Muslim-majority countries that paid a visit to China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region at the invitation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to learn about the region's economic and social development. Algeria's ambassador to China was quoted by local media as saying, "The fruit here is so sweet, just like the life of the people here," adding that he got to know the real situation of Xinjiang, where the rights of people of all ethnic groups are well protected. So, in response to that, M says, "There is an overwhelming amount of evidence which clearly shows that China is currently engaging in genocide against the Uyghur people." There isn't. I understand your point that 30 diplomats from Muslim nations have visited Xinjiang and stated that China is doing an excellent job. However, it is just as important to note that many of these nations rely on China's economic support through the Belt and Road Initiative, so they wouldn't risk talking bad about China. This is a very common response that I get from Western liberals when I bring up this point, and it really, really disturbs me. It's extremely Islamophobic. What M here is claiming, and what many other people before have claimed as well, is that none of these Muslim-majority countries that praise China's work in Xinjiang can be trusted because of their financial interests. What they're essentially saying is that they're all corrupt. Now, the inverse of this, of course, is the condemnations of China from the US and all of their cronies, a bunch of white Western countries in the imperial core. So what M is essentially saying here is that the diplomats from Muslim-majority countries cannot be trusted, but all of the white Western countries that routinely bomb Muslims around the world can be trusted. That is a white supremacist viewpoint. That is extremely racist. M continues, "It's also very important to note and take into consideration that China has been extremely reluctant to allow United Nations investigators, independent agencies, or journalists into the nation to see Xinjiang in the past. I believe the case here to be that China had these diplomats follow an orchestrated visit plan to ensure that these diplomats only saw what the Chinese government wanted to see." This is also very hypocritical from M here. Now, I understand the point that M is making here. Sure, you could say that China showed these diplomats only the nice parts of Xinjiang, whatever you want to say. But, on the inverse, again, if China allows UN investigators or Western journalists to freely tour Xinjiang, what they'll do is lie and misrepresent everything that they see. We have historical precedent for this. Like in 2019, when China allowed the BBC to tour a vocational school, and they produced this little bit of propaganda.
We find some graffiti that reads, "Oh, my heart, don't break." We've decided not to use the image to protect whoever wrote it.
So what the BBC did is they took what is likely a song lyric or something that was written in a bathroom, completely lied about it, told the viewer what to think about it, and then they follow that up with some spooky music and some satellite imagery. This is what Western media does against the enemies of capitalism. They lie and they misrepresent. But watch this part at the end of this little report, conveniently placed there because most people stop watching at some point before this.
With our official tour now finished, we decide to return uninvited to one of the facilities we've already been shown. To our surprise, we find a large group of men waiting silently in rows just inside the gate. And then the buses start to arrive.
So what happened here is BBC came back unannounced, only to find that Uyghurs were being sent home for the weekend from what the BBC had earlier described in this broadcast as a prison. Interesting. M continues. In 2018, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed concern over the disturbing reports of mass detentions in Xinjiang and called on China to allow UN observers into the region, and they cite a OHCHR report from 2022. Then they say, however, these initial attempts were met with strong resistance from the Chinese government, who denied all allegations and refused entry to the UN observers, and they link a Forbes article from 2021. So we'll get to these two links in a second, but M here mentioned that in 2018, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed concern over disturbing reports of mass detentions in Xinjiang, but they didn't link anything related to that. So let's take a look at it ourselves. Here's a Reuters article about it from 2018. UN says it has credible reports that China holds million Uyghurs in secret camps. What happened here is Gay McDougall, a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, cited estimates that 2 million Uyghurs and Muslim minorities were forced into political camps for indoctrination in the western Xinjiang Autonomous Region. According to Reuters here, the allegations came from multiple sources, including activist group Chinese Human Rights Defenders, which said in a report last month that 21% of all arrests recorded in China in 2017 were in Xinjiang. Now, interestingly enough, this 2018 UN statement from Gay McDougall was the first time that this claim of up to 1 million people detained in Xinjiang was popularized. Here's a China File article about it that explains where the 1 million figure for detentions in Xinjiang's camps come from. As this article states, 2 key studies independently arrived around the 1 million mark by using limited data samples to estimate what percentage of the ethnic minority Muslim population is detained. The first estimate was from Adrian Zenz. Adrian Zenz is an employee of the U.S. government. He is a senior fellow and director in China studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., of course. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is an anti-communist organization in the United States, set up by an act of Congress in 1993, just after the end of the Cold War, to raise money to create a national memorial to honor the victims of communism. What it exists to do is to allow the U.S. to start to propagandize against their new Cold War target, China. Now, what's interesting about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is that they have connections to other very interesting anti-communist organizations in the United States. One of their founders is Lee Edwards. Lee Edwards co-founded the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation with the Heritage Foundation's founder and chairman, Edwin Fuellner, and was appointed its chairman emeritus. So the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Heritage Foundation share a founder. If you didn't know, the Heritage Foundation is who created Project 2025. All of these sources are very circular, which you will come to find throughout this video. So Zenz made his estimate based on an accounting of the detention camp populations totaling some 892,000 individuals in 68 Xinjiang counties as of the spring of 2018. These numbers are from a document leaked by Chinese public security authorities to Istiklal, an Uyghur exile media organization based in Turkey, red flag, and also later appeared in Newsweek Japan. See, Adrian Zenz really loves leaked documents. Or maybe he loves leaking documents. That's kind of what he's known for. There are plenty of different instances where leaked documents from anonymous sources were verified as authentic by Adrian Zenz himself. Again, an employee of the US government. The second estimate for the magical 1 million number comes from the Washington, D.C. based, of course, nonprofit Chinese human rights defenders. Now, it's pretty wild how they got their number. Between mid-2017 and mid-2018, CHRD interviewed 8 ethnic Uyghurs located in 8 different villages in southern Xinjiang. Each person gave their own estimate of the number of people detained in their village, which CHRD used to surmise a detention rate for each village. What they then did was extrapolate that to the entire population of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, 12 million people. That's correct. The UN was citing a report with an N of 8 that applies to 12 million people. If you have a statistician friend, go tell them that. Please film their reaction for me. I would love to see it. So yes, in the 2018 statement that M is referring to, the UN made the egregious claim that not even 1 million, up to 2 million Uyghurs had been detained in Xinjiang, and they based that off of a US government worker who had some supposed leaked documents and a Washington, D.C. based organization that used a sample size of 8 for a population of 12 million. Now, before we actually look at the 2022 UN report, we're going to look at this 2021 Forbes article that M cited. Here's that Forbes article. United Nations, China denies allegations of organ harvesting. Yes, organ harvesting. This is Falun Gong propaganda. Now, the Falun Gong has a great many issues and red flags about it. The most recent of which is that one of their executives of the newspaper they run, a propaganda newspaper, is facing money laundering charges. But the Falun Gong is a religious cult that was banned in China because they're kind of psychotic. They're extremely homophobic. They don't believe in race mixing. And they're Trump supporters. They love Trump. The Epoch Times praises Trump all the time. And yes, this is the UN, a group of UN independent experts that were talking about allegations of organ harvesting carried out on minority groups, including Falun Gong practitioners. The UN is citing this deranged, vile cult. And M wonders why China may be reluctant to let UN investigators into Xinjiang. You should not be surprised. Okay, now we'll take a look at the 2022 UN report, which I am very familiar with, of course. I've debunked this report many times from many different angles. It's nonsensical. There's so many glaring red flags with this report. For one, the UN High Commissioner at the time of its release didn't sign it. She resigned immediately after it was published. Who was pushing for this report to be released? I mean, we know, right? Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth on this. I'm just going to show you one citation from it. From page 1, the third citation. For a list of articles and media pieces on the situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, see bibliography of select news reports and academic works available at the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Here's a page on the National Endowment for Democracy's website about the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act building on work of NED grantees. In this article, which is 5 years old at this point, so it's outdated, NED claims that to further human rights and human dignity for all people in China, the National Endowment for Democracy has awarded almost $9 million to Uyghur groups since 2004. One of those groups is, of course, the Uyghur Human Rights Project. They are a grantee of the National Endowment for Democracy. They were started with a grant from the NED. The NED is a regime change organization of the US government. Even Wikipedia describes it as such. They say upon its founding, the NED assumed several former activities of the CIA. Political groups, activists, academics, and some governments have accused the NED of being an instrument of US foreign policy, helping to foster regime change. They just got their funding cut thanks to Elon Musk. Comrade Musk? No? Both of the founders of the NED admit that it's a CIA cutout. One of them, Carl Gershman, said that the NED was created because it would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. The other founder, Alan Weinstein, said a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. See, the NED funds different organizations all around the world to destabilize their enemies. To bring democracy to their enemies. And of course, as another example of how circular all of this propaganda is, Carl Gershman is one of the quotes that I just read out. Well, he is a member of the National Advisory Council of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. That's where Adrian Zenz works. Oh, and one more thing. The founder of the Uyghur Human Rights Project is an alleged sex pest. According to this investigation by Not Us, this is Nuri Turkle here, at least one woman raised concerns to the Human Rights Foundation about his behavior at a 2019 Oslo Freedom Forum gathering that year, and at least one other woman complained in 2022, according to people with knowledge of the conversation. So once again, the 2022 UN report is citing the bibliography from the Uyghur Human Rights Project. So let's take a look at that. So here's the bibliography. This is the PDF of it. And if you can see here at the bottom of the screen, I hit Control F to search the entire document. I put the keyword Zenz in for Adrian Zenz, US government worker, and I got 585 matches. 585 times this bibliography cites a US government worker. Next, I searched for the term rfa.org. That's Radio Free Asia. It gave me more than 1,000 matches. It gave me so many matches that my web browser can't even show me how many. Okay, I went and checked on a different browser. It's 1,411. Almost 1,500 times. This bibliography cites Radio Free Asia. Now, if you aren't aware, Radio Free Asia is American state media. It was originally started by the CIA during the Cold War to propagandize against America's communist enemies. Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia were later preserved by the Clinton administration and repurposed into their modern iterations, which is American state media, operated by US Congress through the US AGM. So this 2022 UN report that not only M is citing, but that is widely cited in the West, in just one of their footnotes, the third footnote, they tell you if you want to learn more about the situation, you should go see this bibliography at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which is funded by a CIA cutout, and which cites a US government worker 585 times, and American state media, started originally by the CIA, almost 1,500 times. Alright, back to M's document. Now they are going to respond to my claim that a tiny portion of Uyghurs were radicalized by ISIS-linked external forces. Over 200 terror attacks were committed in China by radicalized extremist Uyghurs who seek to establish an Islamic ethno-state in Xinjiang, East Turkestan as they call it, by either expelling the around 14 million non-Uyghur residents or subjecting them to a jizya as non-believers or infidels, which the vast majority of Uyghurs do not want. And M says, from my research, I agree with you that only a few hundred Uyghur people joined ISIS. Wow, we agree with each other on something. That's interesting. They continue, as you said, this is a tiny portion of the Uyghur population. There are roughly 11 to 12 million Uyghur people within Xinjiang. I agree. I also don't disagree that there were 200 terror attacks committed by the Turkestan Islamic Party from 1997 onwards. Perfect. There's something interesting about the wording of this response, though. M seems to want to make it very clear that only a few hundred Uyghurs joined ISIS. that it was a tiny portion of the Uyghur population who were radicalized to commit terror attacks. And I mean, I do agree with that, right? I think M wants to emphasize that, though, because they believe that 1 to 2 million Uyghurs have been detained. See, now that would be bad, right? If China had arrested over 1 million Uyghurs for the actions of a few hundred or a few thousand or however many radicalized extremists there were, that would be bad. That's not what's happened, though. Surely M doesn't believe that, right? They go on to address my next claim, which is, eventually Beijing decided to intervene to prevent more terror attacks. They arrested the tiny portion of Uyghur extremists and brought them to high-security facilities for de-radicalization. At the same time, they established vocational schools for the Uyghurs living in remote villages near the border, who were often targeted by these external forces for radicalization. And in response, M says, first, you didn't include any sources for this claim. Now listen. The burden of proof is on the one who makes the claim, right? The claim that we are addressing here is that there is a genocide being committed, or at least human rights violations being committed. Okay? I don't believe that's happening. I do not have the burden of proof. M has the burden of proof. The CIA has the burden of proof because they are making this accusation. China doesn't have to prove that they're not doing a genocide. Their accusers have to prove that they are doing a genocide. See, I'm simply providing this information as a courtesy, as an alternate story to what is happening. I don't need to prove any of these claims. M or anybody watching this, feel free to dismiss them. You don't have to believe them. It doesn't matter either way. You still have the burden of proof if you believe there is a genocide happening. Imagine if we were in the court of law. You would be the prosecution. I would be the defense, right? The defense doesn't have the burden of proof. The prosecution does. The prosecution is accusing the defense of genocide. M says the Chinese government intervened and arrested Uyghur terrorists, but they also arrested thousands of innocent Uyghur people under the guise of re-education. Now, according to various sources, an estimated 1 to 2 million Uyghurs are detained in what is known by the Chinese government as vocational training centers. They believe the 1 million number, not even the 1 million number. They believe it could be up to 2 million Uyghurs detained. Come on, M. Really? Why is vocational training centers in scare quotes? That's exactly what they are. The BBC video that I showed before proved that. They had to put the scary music over top to make you think that it's actually something sinister. They're just vocational training centers, vocational schools. Now, they give 2 citations for this. The first is to Genocide Watch from 2023, and the second is to CNN. We'll look at the Genocide Watch one first. This is the page M linked directly to on genocidewatch.com, China, Country Overview. Now, I believe what they're citing is this report right here. And surprisingly, this is just a one-pager. It's a short one. That's nice. I like that. What I don't like about it is that it directly cites Adrian Zenz, a U.S. government worker. I also don't like that all of these blue highlighted and underlined words that should be hyperlinks are not hyperlinked. I'm not sure if they're supposed to be. I'm not sure if I'm being fooled here or if there's an issue with this PDF, but I cannot click on any of these hyperlinks if that's what they are supposed to be. And what M is citing this report for is this claim that between 800,000 to 2 million Uyghurs have been held in Xinjiang's concentration prisons, not even concentration camps, they call them concentration prisons, commonly referred to as re-education camps. Referred to by who? That's not what China says. But again, if this is a link that they are providing to prove this, I cannot click it. But either way, this report directly cites Adrian Zenz, a U.S. government worker. So I'm going to dismiss it just based off of that alone. But there's something else on this page that M linked. It's this part, this little table under Country Overview. It says targeted groups, Uyghurs, other Turkic minorities in Xinjiang, perpetrators, government officials / police, Chinese government officials and police. Alert status emergency, wow. Genocide stage 9 extermination? Also on Genocide Watch's website, they have the 10 stages of genocide where they explain each one. This is what they say for extermination, which they claim is what applies to Xinjiang. Extermination begins and quickly becomes the mass killing legally called genocide. Who is claiming that there is mass killing? Even the CIA doesn't claim that. Now, there is something that I like to do with these types of sources that make these absurd claims about China. I like to see what they say about Palestine. Because, after all, 40 different countries accuse Israel of genocide at this time, but also the UN does, our friend the UN, and even Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch all accuse Israel of committing genocide. Okay? So what does Genocide Watch say? Let's look at their little table. They got the alert status only warning, and the genocide stage is only up to 7, preparation. What? So the fake CIA genocide that's supposedly happening in Xinjiang is worse than what we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears that's happening in Palestine, that has taken up to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian lives? That's not mass killing? Also, look at how they both sides it. Look at the targeted groups. Palestinians, yep. Israeli war crime victims, they're both sidesing it. LGBTQIA plus people, I'm sure they're referring to Hamas throwing gay people off of roofs, that stupid Hasbara. They're of course ignoring the fact that Israeli bombs are indiscriminate and are actually killing LGBTQIA plus people in Palestine. But they also say that the perpetrators are the Israeli government, the Israeli Defense Force, and Hamas. Yeah, so this interesting source says there's no actual genocide happening in Palestine. They both sides it, but apparently somehow, with zero evidence, there is mass extermination happening against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Wow. No, I'm of course not surprised by this source at all, considering the fact that their founding president and chairman is a Fed. Dr. Stanton served in the U.S. State Department from 1992 to 1999, so this is a retired Fed. But also their board of directors and their board of advisors is full of a bunch of other Feds and military people and NATO people. The usual fare. They got Samantha Power on there from USAID. Yeah, that's interesting. Genocide Watch is also headquartered in Washington, D.C. Of course. Well, that one was a spectacular failure. Let's see if M can redeem themselves with this CNN article. I doubt it. Here it is. Some are just psychopaths. Chinese detective in exile reveals extent of torture against Uyghurs. This is testimony from an anonymous ex-detective turned whistleblower. Utterly useless. CNN cannot independently confirm Jiang's claims. Yeah, this is useless to me. But anyways, I believe that M was citing this for the same claim that up to 2 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities have been detained. And of course, the source of this is the U.S. State Department. They're just directly citing the U.S. government. Why the hell not? Oof, let's continue. These facilities are described as de-radicalization camps by the Chinese government. No, they aren't. Their purpose is to de-radicalize those who the Chinese government believe have been radicalized. In reality, these centers operate as sites of torture, indoctrination, and forced labor. No, they don't. Multiple reports and sources that cover this genocide, it's not one, highlight how the Uyghur people who are being detained within these camps face systemic abuse such as sexual violence and forced sterilization. Ooh, new claims to debunk with 3 sources for it. So the first citation for this claim is to the same 2022 UN report, so I guess we'll take a look at it and find the citation for that claim specifically. So here is the first mention of alleged arbitrary detention on a broad scale in so-called camps, quote unquote, as well as claims of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual violence and forced labor, among others. It's to footnote 3. Yes, the same footnote 3. The footnote 3 that tells you to go look at the bibliography from Uyghur Human Rights Project. The one that cites Adrian Zenz, a U.S. government worker, over 500 times, and Radio Free Asia, American state media, almost 1,500 times. But hey, listen, there's a second part to this citation, which I skipped over before, so we can look at that. Public victim accounts are available on the Xinjiang Victims Database at shahit.biz. I'm also very familiar with this source. The Xinjiang Victims Database is just that. Well, it's a victims database. It's user submitted. Anyone can submit an entry to this database. And when you do so, you are supposed to offer some information to back up your claim, perhaps. Now, just to give you an example of the kinds of submissions that they get, since it's a database, it should be searchable, right? It kind of is. What you can do is go to the lists page, and it gives you different categories that you can download. So the one with the most entries, 26,999 out of the total 83,911, are entries that mention specific prisons. So when I click that and try to download a PDF of it, it's too big, too many entries for one, so it splits it into 6 parts. So we're just going to take a look at the first one. Once again, if you look at the bottom of the page here, I hit Control F, I searched the term Radio Free Asia, and I got 380 matches. 380 different, it just went up 384, it's still searching through. Hundreds of times this section of submissions cites American state media. So essentially what happens here is someone submits a person who supposedly went missing in Xinjiang or whatever it is they're claiming, and to back that up, they just cite Radio Free Asia a bunch of times. Now there's something I didn't mention about Radio Free Asia before. I just found one of the random links to it in that document. Here it is. 3 Uyghur intellectuals jailed for separatism, political study film reveals. Now, the problem with Radio Free Asia is that they almost exclusively use anonymous sources. You can say RFA's Uyghur service has learned. RFA's Uyghur service received a letter last month from an anonymous former official in Xinjiang. So not only is it American state media, originally started by the CIA to spread propaganda about America's enemies, but they also almost exclusively use anonymous sources. Yikes. All right, let's look at the second citation here, USIP 2023. It's the United States Institute of Peace. This is part of the U.S. government. This is a straight-up U.S. government source again. Here's their About page. Congress founded the U.S. Institute of Peace in 1984 as a nonpartisan, independent organization, dedicated to protecting U.S. interests by helping to prevent violent conflicts and broker peace deals abroad. They help make America stronger by projecting U.S. influence, that's called imperialism, and bolstering U.S. allies, again, imperialism, in regions destabilized by China and other U.S. adversaries. They exist directly to counter China. They have deep partnerships with the Department of Defense. These are war hawks, M. Their priorities are to counter the destabilizing influence of China. Why did you cite this? Anyways, here's the report, and here's the part that it's specifically being cited for, I believe, right? Over 1 million Uyghurs have been imprisoned in re-education centers and subjected to forced labor, torture, rape, and sterilization. Let's see what this link goes to. The latest at USIP, the fight for Uyghur women's human rights in China. It's written by Gulchehra Hoja. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Yeah, she's a Radio Free Asia reporter for the last 24 years. Remember when I said this was all circular? Alright, let's see the third citation. Maybe this one is legitimate. It's to Human Rights Watch from 2021. Here it is. Break their lineage, break their roots. China's crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Just like with the 2022 UN report, I'm very familiar with this report. I've debunked it many times. Now, I'm not a legal expert, but Jack James from Co-West Pro is. And she has released a working paper that tackles this report from a legal basis. I would highly recommend anyone watching this video, and especially M, to read this working paper. It's great. This report is complete garbage. Absolute junk research. But of course, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know how to do something. I know how to do a Control F. I search for the keyword Zens, I get 20 matches. 20 times it cites Adrian Zenz, a US government worker. I search for the term Radio Free Asia, 18 matches. 18 times they cite American state media originally started by the CIA. But of course, M was citing this for the sexual violence and sterilization claim, so that is what this section of the report is about. So we can take a look at the first citation here from the BBC. I mean, it's British state media, so not much better than Radio Free Asia, but maybe a little more trustworthy at least. This article is titled, "Their Goal is to Destroy Everyone. Uyghur Camp Detainees Allege Systematic Rape." Human rights groups say the Chinese government has gradually stripped away the religious and other freedoms of the Uyghurs, culminating in an oppressive system of mass surveillance, detention, indoctrination, and even forced sterilization. Let's see where this link goes. It takes us to another BBC article. China forcing birth control on Uyghurs to suppress population, report says. The report by China scholar Adrian Zenz has prompted international calls for the United Nations to investigate. It's citing Adrian Zenz, a US government worker. Back to the Human Rights Watch report, there's one more thing I want to show. There are indications that these national birth control policies have been implemented more strictly than before in Xinjiang during the Strike Hard campaign, out of a stated concern that resistance to family planning policy is the result of an adherence to religious extremism as an ideological virus that the government has determined needs to be eradicated. Citation 198. It's directly to Adrian Zenz. Not only is it to Adrian Zenz, it's to an article that Adrian Zenz wrote that is hosted at the Jamestown Foundation, jamestown.org. Here's the Wikipedia page for the Jamestown Foundation. Central Intelligence Agency Director William J. Casey helped back the formation of the Jamestown Foundation, agreeing with its complaints that the U.S. intelligence community did not provide enough sufficient funding for Soviet bloc defectors. So the Jamestown Foundation that Human Rights Watch is citing was started by the director of the CIA at the time and was created specifically to spread propaganda about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Wow, okay, let's move on to M's response to my next claim. These vocational schools existed to prepare the portion of Uyghurs who had been living without running water or electricity or modern medicine to integrate into modern society with all the creature comforts that it provides. They were given the opportunity to join job placement programs to start earning money to live in newly developed areas. M responds, "You didn't include any sources for this claim. Once again, the burden of proof is not on me. Feel free to disregard what I say here. You still have to prove your allegations." They continue. First, I would like to point out that you frame these quote-unquote vocational schools, again in scare quotes, as sounding optional. This is extremely misleading because these vocational schools, quote-unquote, are not optional. Now, I don't know where you're from, M, but I can guarantee one thing. Wherever you grew up, there was mandatory schooling. I grew up in Canada. Legally, I had to attend school, at least for some portion of time. I didn't necessarily have to graduate high school, but I had to go to school. Mandatory schooling is not exclusive to China or Xinjiang. It's everywhere in the world. You're doing this weird Orientalist thing where you say that this thing that happens across the world is bad when it happens in China. Mandatory schooling is good. Period. End of story. They go on. These places serve as prisons and torture grounds. No, they don't. For the estimated 1 to 2 million Uyghurs, you haven't proven that have been wrongfully detained by the Chinese government. You haven't proven any of this, M. What you've cited previously is just the same two sources, just with a few extra steps to jump through to get there first, in some instances. Adrian Zenz and Radio Free Asia. That's all you've cited. Continuing. Second, many of these job placement, again in scare quotes, opportunities you describe are forced labor camps or factories. While forced labor is not explicitly stated under the Genocide Act, it can be argued that forced labor is a tool used to cause bodily and mental harm to members of the Uyghur population, which would be another violation of Article 2. A report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute report documents that Uyghur people that the Chinese government has detained are transferred from camps to factories across China, and they give me a link to the ASPI. A new player has entered the game. You know, I really love when people cite the ASPI because then I get to show their funding sources. Here's from their funding page. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is a wholly owned Commonwealth company formed in 2001 as an independent, but not really, nonpartisan think tank. ASPI receives funding from Australian and overseas governments. Gee, I wonder which ones. So the ASPI was started by the Australian government. It's funded mostly by the Australian government, but also by a bunch of overseas governments. Here's their overseas government funding from 2022 to 2023. You see all these different projects that the U.S. Department of State funded to the tune of millions of dollars per year. Do you know which one's my favorite? The Disinformation and Social Media Project that they gave almost $500,000 for. This is another funding report from previous years. In 2019 to 2020, they also got funded by a smattering of defense contractors: Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon. These are all entities that are currently creating the weapons that are exploding Palestinian children. They are also funded by capitalist megacorporations like Microsoft and Meta. But you know, when I first found this Disinformation and Social Media Project, it really interested me. So I decided to go and see what specifically it was that the U.S. Department of State had given $500,000 for. And I found this website that the ASPI created, Understanding Global Disinformation and Information Operations. Now, what they did is basically just trawl Twitter to try to find disinformation operations from state actors. And they give a list of all of the different countries that they found who were doing disinformation on Twitter. Do you see something missing from this list? Two things missing from this list. No Australia, no USA. In fact, none of the governments that fund ASPI appear on this list. What we do have is Cuba, America and Australia's enemy, China, Russia, Iran. These are all enemies of both America and Australia. Isn't that interesting? Now listen, I know what you might be saying. Maybe the United States just isn't doing disinformation on Twitter, so the ASPI didn't find anything. Whoops. Here's a Reuters investigation. Pentagon ran secret anti-vax campaign to undermine China during pandemic. So Reuters caught the US military launching a clandestine program to discredit China's Sinovac inoculation. They did this on Twitter. They spread memes about the Sinovac vaccination that China was offering to its neighbors. They were trying to say that the vaccination would give you the virus. They were trying to convince Filipino people to not take the vaccine. This disinformation campaign almost certainly had a death toll from people who didn't get vaccinated and died of COVID. US disinformation campaigns on Twitter quite literally kill people. ASPI, you better go and update this website, because if you don't, it's going to prove how biased you are towards your funders and against the enemies of your funders. Anyways, we can look at the actual report now that we know who the ASPI is and where their biases lie. But once again, the excellent Jack James from CoWest Pro has debunked this report, again on a legal basis. It's also complete junk science. Go read her working paper on it. But let me just read the beginning of it for you. The Chinese government has facilitated the mass transfer of Uyghur and other ethnic minority citizens from the far west region of Xinjiang to factories across the country. Under conditions that strongly suggest forced labor, Uyghurs are working in factories that are in the supply chains of at least 82 well-known global brands in the technology, clothing, and automotive sectors, including Apple, BMW, Gap, Huawei, Nike, Samsung, Sony, and Volkswagen. So what we have here is the ASPI, which, as I showed you, is not only funded by all of China's enemies, but also completely biased towards them and against China. They're just doing vibes-based reporting here. They say that the conditions strongly suggest forced labor. I don't care what the ASPI thinks that these conditions suggest. I like facts and evidence. I don't like vibes-based reporting from organizations like the ASPI. I just don't accept it. Now, one thing that I am very happy about is that they specifically mentioned Volkswagen in this paragraph here. They say that Volkswagen is one of the well-known global brands that use Uyghur labor. I like that they mentioned it because Volkswagen has done multiple audits of their sites in Xinjiang. And both times, they have found no sign of forced labor. The person responsible for the audit said the employees are paid above average and have little to do. Wow, can you believe what China is doing to their minority population? They're placing them in jobs where they're paid above average and are not overworked. How dare they? Now, Skechers, the shoe company, wasn't mentioned in that specific paragraph, but they are mentioned in the ASPI report. And in response to the report, they also did an audit on their Xinjiang operations. Since the ASPI report was published, Skechers has conducted 2 additional audits of their operations in Xinjiang, including an unannounced audit in June 2020 specifically directed at investigating the ASPI allegations, and another audit in November 2020. Neither of these audits revealed any indications of the use of forced labor, either of Uyghurs or any other ethnic or religious group, nor did the audits raise any other concerns about general labor conditions. They say Skechers has no reason to believe that Liu Zhao is using any forced labor. Nonetheless, Skechers will continue to closely monitor and audit them and all factories and suppliers globally. Do you know who does use forced labor? The US does. You know, that government that funds the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the one that they're biased towards. Here's an AP article. Prisoners in the US are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands. If you have consumed products from any of these companies, they may have been created with forced prison labor in America. This is not even an exhaustive list, by the way. See, because the US never actually abolished slavery. They simply modernized it into the prison industrial complex. Under the 13th Amendment, slavery is illegal unless it's for someone convicted of a crime. Now, what the US did is they made up a bunch of laws to specifically target black and brown people. They released drugs into black and brown communities so that they could arrest black and brown people disproportionately and use them for slave labor. The US has 25% of the world's prison population, despite having only 5% of the world's total population, meaning on average, they have 5 times more prisoners than the rest of the world. That, however, did not stop them from passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which takes jobs away from Uyghurs in Xinjiang because they are accusing China of using them for forced labor, despite being the biggest purveyor of forced labor in the entire world. But wait, I thought the US government cared about Muslims in China. Why are they taking away their ability to earn a living? Could somebody please explain that? You know, I really wish someone would write a report about the US's prison industrial complex and the slave labor that exists within it and how they are simply projecting their own atrocities onto their enemies, the ASPI seems like a great option, but oh wait, they're paid millions of dollars by the U.S. Department of State per year, and they won't ever say anything negative about them because of that, as I've shown. Listen, M continues to spread a lot more nonsensical propaganda from organizations like the ASPI. They directly cite the ASPI again. They cite the Department of Labor, again the U.S. government. I think we've seen enough. M responds to one more of my claims in this document, but this video is already long enough, so if you want to see me reply to their response, you can either see the TikTok video that I made, which I will link in the description, or you can read the Substack article about this document. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to subscribe to me and hit the bell for notifications, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.